The Prowler arrived in 1981, carrying a weight few slashers of its time were prepared to bear. Too intense to feel lighthearted. Too straightforward to feel distant. While many horror films of the era were beginning to soften fear through style and suggestion, the Prowler moved in a far more direct direction. Its violence wasn't dressed up or exaggerated. It was presented plainly with a sense of physical presence that made it difficult to ignore. Behind the film's simple setup was a creative approach that valued realism over comfort. Practical effects were treated as craft rather than spectacle, and atmosphere was allowed to linger without apology. Those choices gave the film a distinct personality, but they also complicated how it was received. As it moved through theaters and across borders, the Prowler was shaped by hesitation edits and changing expectations. What audiences encountered often depended on when and where they saw it. What remains today is not just a slasher from the early 80s, but a film defined by its refusal to soften itself for the moment. These are the unusual and often forgotten facts behind the Prowler. A movie remembered as much for its persistence as for its impact. A horror film that placed realism above restraint. A release history shaped by edits, alterations, and renamed versions. And a reputation that continued to grow long after its initial run ended. These are 18 strange facts about the Prowler, where creative conviction came at a cost. Subtlety was never the goal, and time slowly transformed resistance into recognition. Number 1. The Prowler emerged at a moment when the slasher formula was already familiar, but its execution felt unusually heavy. By the early 1980s, audiences had grown accustomed to masked killers and recognizable patterns. Horror films were becoming efficient, relying on repetition and rhythm to deliver safe expectations. The Prowler followed the outline of the genre, but it treated its moments differently. Violence was allowed to feel deliberate rather than fleeting, and scenes were given time to settle instead of rushing forward. This approach immediately separated the film from many of its contemporaries. It stood out, but not in a way that guaranteed comfort or easy acceptance. That early decision to slow things down and emphasize realism shaped everything that followed, setting the tone for a film that would never quite blend into the crowd. Number 2. The film's lasting identity was built almost entirely around its practical effects. Rather than relying on implication or off-screen suggestion, the Prowler placed its emphasis on physical detail. Each effect was designed to feel tangible, as though it existed in the same space as the characters. For the creators, this was a matter of authenticity. The effects weren't meant to shock through excess, but to ground the horror in something believable. For audiences, the reaction was often stronger. The realism removed emotional distance, making scenes harder to forget and harder to dismiss. Over time, what once caused discomfort became the element most often praised, a reminder that the film's reputation was forged through commitment rather than restraint. Number 3. The version of the Prowler people remember often depends on where they first encountered it. As the film traveled internationally, it rarely remained unchanged. Certain releases trimmed moments considered too intense, while others altered presentation in an effort to fit local expectations. These changes affected more than runtime. They reshaped pacing, tone, and emotional impact, creating subtly different experiences for different audiences. As a result, the film developed more than one identity. Some viewers remember it as harsh and unflinching, while others recall a noticeably restrained version. That fragmented history became part of the film's legacy, proof that the Prowler wasn't just shaped by its creators, but by the boundaries it was asked to fit within. Number 4. The killer's appearance was built around familiarity rather than spectacle. Instead of relying on an elaborate costume designed to impress, the Prowler chose something more restrained. The uniform, the boots, and the overall look felt practical, almost ordinary, as if the figure could disappear into any crowd. That simplicity wasn't accidental. It was meant to remove the safety of fantasy and replace it with something closer to real life. The killer didn't feel like a character from a story, but like a presence that belonged to the same world as everyone else on screen. For audiences, this made the film's tension harder to shake. There was no exaggerated mask to signal distance or comfort. The threat felt grounded, direct, and unsettlingly close. Over time, that understated design proved more memorable than excess, reinforcing the film's commitment to realism in even its quietest choices. Number 5. The film's sense of dread relied heavily on patience rather than speed. While many slashers of the era favored rapid pacing and constant escalation, the Prowler often slowed itself down. Scenes were allowed to stretch, letting anticipation build long before anything violent occurred. This deliberate rhythm gave weight to otherwise simple moments. Empty spaces, lingering camera movement, and measured timing turned silence into a source of unease. For some viewers at the time, this approach felt unusual, even uncomfortable. It challenged expectations of what a slasher should feel like, refusing to rush toward release. Years later, that patience reads as confidence proof that tension doesn't need constant motion to remain effective. Number 6. The Prowler arrived during a period when the genre was already crowded with familiar faces. By the early 80s, slasher films were becoming increasingly recognizable. Audiences knew the patterns, the pacing, and the promises that usually came with the territory. The Prowler followed the basic framework, but it didn't lean into repetition for reassurance. Its rough edges and heavy tone made it harder to position alongside more polished entries. This left the film in an awkward space. It was clearly part of the trend, yet unwilling to smooth itself into something easily digestible. That uncertainty limited its immediate reach, but it also ensured the film would never feel interchangeable, a distinction that only grew clearer with time. Number 7. Some of the film's most unsettling power comes from how long it refuses to look away. Rather than cutting quickly or softening moments through editing, the Prowler often allows scenes to unfold with an uncomfortable steadiness. The camera remains present, letting actions play out without offering relief. This wasn't done to provoke shock alone. It reflected a belief that fear lingers longer when viewers are asked to stay with a moment instead of escaping it. The lack of interruption makes each scene feel heavier, more permanent. For early audiences, this approach was difficult. It challenged the idea that horror should provide quick release or emotional distance. With time, those same moments became the film's defining memory reminders of a slasher that trusted stillness and duration as tools of unease. Number 8. Audience reaction to the Prowler was deeply influenced by what viewers expected going in. Many arrived anticipating something familiar, a slasher that followed established rhythms and delivered predictable tension. What they encountered felt colder, more deliberate, and less forgiving. This mismatch shaped early impressions. Some viewers felt unsettled in ways they hadn't planned for, while others struggled to connect with a film that refused to comfort them, rather than being embraced or rejected outright. The Prowler existed in a space of uncertainty. It was discussed cautiously, remembered in fragments, and often described rather than revisited. Looking back, that reaction reads as a sign that the film quietly stepped beyond the boundaries audiences were ready for at the time. Number 9. Distance allowed the film to be seen more clearly than it ever was at release. As years passed, the immediate cultural anxiety surrounding screen violence began to fade. When viewers returned to the Prowler, they did so with fewer expectations and more curiosity. What once felt excessive now appeared intentional. The pacing, the effects, and the tone could finally be judged on their own terms, rather than against the climate of the moment. This slow re-evaluation didn't come from promotion or revival campaigns. It happened quietly through late discoveries and personal recommendations. In that way, the Prowler didn't demand reassessment. It waited until audiences were ready to meet it halfway. Number 10. Silence in the Prowler is never empty. It is deliberately unsettling. Between moments of violence, the film repeatedly pulls back into quiet. Footsteps echo, spaces feel hollow, and time seems to stretch without music guiding the audience's emotions. This use of silence creates anticipation rather than relief. Viewers are left alone with the environment, waiting for something to break the stillness. The absence of sound becomes its own form of tension. At a time when many slashers relied on constant noise and movement, this restraint felt unusual. The Prowler trusted that unease could grow naturally without being forced. Decades later, those quiet moments remain some of the most effective, proving that fear often works best when it whispers instead of shouts. Number 11, the film's depiction of violence avoids metaphor and leans toward physical consequence. There is little attempt to stylize or soften what happens on screen. Each action feels grounded, immediate, and final, as if the film wants viewers to understand the weight of every moment. This approach removes the buffer that fantasy often provides. Without exaggeration, the violence feels closer to reality, making it harder to watch and harder to forget. For some audiences, this was deeply uncomfortable. For others, it gave the horror a seriousness rarely seen in similar films of the era. Over time, this physical realism became one of the film's most defining traits, setting it apart from slashers that chose spectacle over substance. Number 12, The Prowler found its audience through endurance rather than attention. The film didn't arrive with widespread praise or instant recognition. Instead, it slowly circulated, discovered in late-night screenings, home video collections, and quiet recommendations. Those who found it often did so without expectations, encountering a film that felt heavier and more deliberate than anticipated. That sense of discovery became part of its appeal. Without hype shaping perception, viewers were free to respond honestly, to admire it, question it, or simply remember it. In that slow, unassuming way, The Prowler built a following that valued the film not for its popularity, but for its persistence. Number 13. The film's identity grew through conversation rather than promotion. Long before The Prowler was widely reassessed, it lived in stories passed between viewers. People didn't describe it with marketing language. They talked about moments, scenes that stayed with them, images that were difficult to shake. This word-of-mouth legacy shaped how new audiences approached the film. Expectations were formed not by trailers or posters, but by fragments of memory shared by others. Sometimes that anticipation intensified the experience. Other times it softened it. Either way, the film was rarely encountered without a sense of curiosity already attached. Over time, those shared recollections became part of The Prowler itself, a reputation built as much by memory as by the movie on screen. Number 14. Revisiting the film outside its original era reveals details once overlooked. Freed from the immediate reactions of its release period, The Prowler can be watched with a different kind of attention. Elements that once felt confrontational begin to feel deliberate. The framing, the pacing, and the atmosphere reveal a consistency that wasn't always recognized at first. What seemed harsh now reads as intentional restraint. This shift doesn't come from changing the film. It comes from changing distance. Time allows space for appreciation where resistance once existed. Sometimes a film doesn't need revision. It simply needs patience from its audience. Number 15. The film's lack of expansion helped preserve its distinct voice. Unlike many slashers that evolved into franchises, The Prowler remained contained. There were no sequels to reinterpret its tone or dilute its choices. This singularity gave the film a sense of finality. What viewers experienced was complete, unaltered by repetition or reinvention. That closure allowed the movie to exist as a snapshot, rather than a series, a specific moment captured and left untouched. In a genre often defined by continuation, The Prowler stands apart by remaining exactly what it was from the beginning. Number 16. Much of the film's unease comes from how it treats space as something indifferent. The Prowler often allows its locations to exist without urgency. Hallways feel longer than they should. Outdoor spaces feel strangely empty. The camera lingers just long enough for silence to become uncomfortable. This sense of space creates isolation rather than excitement. Characters move through environments that offer no comfort and no warning. The world around them doesn't react, it simply exists. That emotional distance deepens the film's tone. Horror doesn't erupt from chaos, but from stillness. The environment feels unconcerned with what's happening inside it. Years later, those quiet spaces remain some of the film's most haunting elements, reminding viewers that fear can grow where nothing seems to care. Number 17. The film's reputation survived by remaining present rather than prominent. The Prowler didn't benefit from constant rediscovery cycles or mainstream revival. Instead, it stayed alive through steady, quiet exposure screenings, home collections, and personal recommendations. Each encounter added another layer to its reputation. New viewers brought fresh perspectives, often finding details that earlier audiences had missed or dismissed. This slow accumulation of appreciation created a form of respect that didn't rely on trends. The film wasn't rebranded or reframed. It was simply allowed to endure. That endurance became its strength, ensuring the film remained visible without ever needing to be loud. Number 18. The Prowler represents a moment when horror briefly chose commitment over comfort. The film doesn't soften its tone or guide viewers toward relief. It presents its choices plainly and allows the consequences to settle without explanation. That approach may have limited its reach when it first appeared, but it also protected its identity. Nothing about the film feels revised or diluted by time. Looking back, The Prowler feels less like a product of its era and more like a statement, a reminder that horror can be effective when it trusts its instincts completely. Sometimes the films that last aren't the ones that adapt the fastest, but the ones that remain exactly as they are. Bonus fact: The Prowler gained clarity only after the noise around it faded. When the film first appeared, conversation focused almost entirely on reaction. What felt too much, too heavy, too close to comfort. Those responses often drowned out quieter elements that required time to notice. Years later, revisiting the film without that immediate pressure changes the experience. The pacing feels intentional rather than slow. The effects read as deliberate craft rather than provocation. The atmosphere settles into something cohesive. This shift didn't happen because the film changed, but because the context around it did. Distance allowed the movie to be seen without urgency, judged without expectation. In that space, The Prowler revealed itself more clearly, not as a challenge to endure, but as a work that trusted patience and consistency to leave its mark. In the end, The Prowler stands as an example of how some films are shaped less by their debut than by their endurance. It didn't arrive fully understood, and it didn't try to be reassuring. What once felt confrontational softened into purpose. What once divided opinion gradually found appreciation. The film's identity remained intact because it never chased acceptance, it waited for it. If you've seen The Prowler, which detail stayed with you the longest? A moment, a mood, or simply the way it made you feel? And if you're encountering it now, does knowing its journey change how it lands? Sometimes the movies that matter most aren't the ones that arrive at the right moment, but the ones that find their audience when the moment finally catches up to them.